Hello, this video is to orient you to our final weekend of research. What you're looking at right now is the flatlands in the San Luis Valley, close to the Everson Ranch where we'll be working. You can see that it is a very dry, formerly grazed landscape. As we move through the pictures, I'll be showing you the restoration effort conducted by the DOW. They obviously did some recontouring on the ditch, and they also did some pole planting, probably with plants from the state nursery. So without further ado, so there is a small reservoir on the Everson Ranch, and here's an example of the pole planting. You can barely see the plants within these plastic nets. They're basically one stem. And the thought behind this kind of restoration technique is that these plants have their feet in the water table, and that is how they're going to make it. It's still really early in the season, so when these pictures were taken, hopefully the last weekend of April, we'll get to assess how many of these are alive and how many are dead. Here's another image. Here's the road you'll drive in on, and the ranch is actually over to the west. Here's some signs of wildlife use. This is a moose print here, but also you can notice the soil is so dry, and it's primarily mineral soil without a lot of organic matter, which would be typical of a fallow field that lacks any existing native grasses. So here's this next several pictures show you the recontouring. So I'm sure you can all imagine what an agricultural ditch looks like. It's perfectly straight. They used heavy equipment to add in these meanders. While we're working, we will have an opportunity to measure the velocity at various curves and to understand the ecological role that slowing the water down plays. One role, for example, is the construction of little riffles which add oxygen to the water. You can see that compared to that first picture, there is taller vegetation right near these slower meanders. You can also see in the background here that there are some older shrubs and trees that are left over from where the ditch first ran, and also you can see here there's some kind of nest, and hopefully we'll be able to identify the bird living in that nest. In the background you see here the stingrays, and you can see the great vertical relief. The hot springs are actually up on the slope here, as is the bat caves at the mine. So you can see that this is a very dense grass cover here, and that's what we're hoping for across the whole rangeland. But of course we don't have that anymore. In the process of talking with the land managers, I learned that the water table here has dropped 68 feet because of the well drilling that has taken place in the last decade or so. Here's an example of one of the re-veg grasses they used. This is either slender wheat or intermediate wheat. Intermediate is a hybrid, slender is a native, and others that you might have heard of are crested wheat. Crested wheat is more invasive revegetation grass. Here's some rabbit brush. This I believe is skeleton weed, but again it's really early in the season, so I predict that we'll be able to identify these plants with more ease because they'll have some leaves already. This is a fescue, another revegetation grass. So we've been talking a lot about weeds versus native plants, And actually, a lot of the grasses that are typically used in revegetation in the West are not native species. But the idea is that they'll stabilize the soil, increase the organic matter, and the native species will follow. When you're identifying grasses, it's important to look very closely at the plant parts, and actually grasses have flowers, and it's quite a treat when you get close enough to actually see those flowers. Again, I think it will be a little early for flowering, but we should see greener grasses instead of these grasses which are left over from last year. Here are some aquatic species that are present along the banks of the recontoured ditch. This is an ephemeral pool. It's also called a fen. And these are really important micro ecosystems for amphibian breeding and invertebrate breeding early in the season. That would probably dry up by mid-June to early July. Here's a yarrow. There are a few forbs, although I wasn't able to see very many in my walk of the site. And in the background, this kind of bark is characteristic of Russian olive, which, as you all know, is my favorite thing to talk about. My research subject, Russian olive, in riparian restoration efforts. It is a non-native plant that is quite invasive. There's also indication that it changes the soil chemistry as it does fix nitrogen in the soil. Here we see some willows and some forbs in the foreground. Usually the willows brighten with color once the phloem starts moving through the plant. Alright, well that's it. I hope this helps you to understand where we'll be going. We'll be looking at, as I mentioned before, some hydrology parameters, vegetation of course, and also wildlife presence.